Welcome to this episode from New South Wales Family Day Care Association's PD in Your Pocket program. The topic for this month is making professional decisions in family day care. This is a recording of the webinar presentation on the 26th of March, 2024, and was presented by Catharine Hydon. This webinar also includes the panel discussion with Dr. Ann Kennedy, Sharon Foran, Kylie McGovern, and the discussion is also moderated by Catharine Hydon.
Well, good evening, everybody. I think we might get started because we've got lots of content to cover and we've got a number of people who are still coming online. So I think let's get started. Good evening, everybody. My name is Catharine Hydon and it's fantastic to be here for PD in Your Pocket. Hopefully all of the people who are joining us have been participating in a number of PDs in Your Pocket over the last couple of years. But if you're new to this platform, then welcome particularly to you. Great to have you here. We know we've got people from all around New South Wales and indeed across the border. And today we'll be focusing on making professional decisions in family day care. So great conversation for us to have together. We look forward to some of your thoughts and questions in the chat. The amazing Nikki from New South Wales Family Day Care is in the chat, so please take advantage of conversations and discussions in that space. And if you haven't already, if you can just take a little moment to maybe grab a piece of paper and a pen, because we'll need that as we get going today. And of course, you hopefully have all downloaded your PD in Your Pocket booklet. Of course, those people who are familiar with this platform will know that this is a really fantastic accompanying document that starts to explore some of those ideas that we're going to talk about. So you can go back and revisit those ideas and share them with your coordination team. You might want to have a conversation with your educational leader about that. You might want to talk to each other about that in whatever context you're in. So thank you, everybody, for making the time to be here. We know that it's a really busy time and hopefully you've had something to eat and you've got a cup of tea in your hand as we have this discussion today. It's my absolute pleasure to be part of the PD in Your Pocket program, and we particularly thank the New South Wales Family Day Care and all of those people who've helped put this together, because it's a really fantastic opportunity for people to come together and learn some more about being a professional in family day care. So, of course, one of the things that we do when we gather together in opportunities like this is to pause for a moment and acknowledge the traditional owners on whose country we are all collectively on. And we're going to be on different lands across New South Wales and indeed across Australia. And I particularly pause for a moment here to acknowledge the traditional owners and the ways in which they have helped us understand what it is to learn and grow on country. I acknowledge that this land was never ceded and that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, families and children continue to struggle in terms of justice and equality. We also know that the Early Years Learning Framework has a very strong imperative now for action in this space. And I wanted just to take this opportunity to acknowledge that acknowledgement is indeed a decision. It's one of your most fundamental professional decisions. To acknowledge country and to take a moment to do that and to think about the connections to your everyday work as a family day care educator is a decision. And it's a decision that we make in order to value the rights and best interests of children, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, so we can all together work for a more just future. So as you may know, I do like to have opportunities here for you to participate as much as possible. We have the chat function and we've got lots of comments, and welcome to everybody who has coming in still. And I know that some of you are juggling children and other things in your life at this point of the evening. But I really like to encourage you as we talk today to use this thinking protocol, something that I've used before, to help think about your response to the ideas that we talk about. So we're going to talk about lots of different things, and we're going to have this amazing panel conversation, something a little bit different for you all. And this time I would like you to maybe get a piece of paper, have it handy, sticky note will do, and back of an envelope, and maybe write a couple of thoughts in these three sections. And this is a great conversation to have with your educational leader. If you're an educational leader, it's great to have this with the leadership team, have this conversation with your colleagues, and you might like to use this tool. There are 3 sections, and I'll remind you about this as we go. The first one is about connection. So what are the ideas that I share with you tonight that connect with your existing practice? The second idea is what ideas extend you. So they just push your thinking out a little bit. And then what ideas are really challenging? So what really challenges your thinking? One of the things that we make a commitment to when we're professionals in family daycare, maybe a term that you don't use all the time, but I want to encourage you to think about using that term, is to think about how we make decisions and then put some frames around that decision so we can go back and revisit them and think about what their implications are for our everyday practice. So it's a good way to sort out your thoughts and also maybe to think about how you might use these ideas moving forward. So connect, extend, and challenge. So make a little note of those as we progress. Love to hear some of the things that you're challenged by in the chat, because we'd love to hear some of those thoughts as we progress. Now, of course, one of the things that happens in these PD in your pocket opportunities is that we ask you a few questions about some of these ideas before we have this presentation. And these are really fascinating results. So thank you to the team at New South Wales Family Day Care for putting these out there and collecting and collating this data. So we asked you, firstly, which one of the following are you most confident about in when you're making decisions? And really excitedly, you're saying you're very confident when it comes to making decisions about children, which is great news. And congratulations you all for making such, being so confident about the decisions that you make in that regard. We also asked you, which is the area that you may be least confident in, and this is really interesting results. You can see here that we've got quite a number of you said that making decisions around improving quality was something that you were least confident about. And also you said some compliance and regulation things you were not that confident about either at times. And you also said that maybe the learning program, the program planning place is something that you felt a little bit less confident about. It's not that you're not confident, it's just that you're a little bit less confident about that. And we'll pick up some of these things. It's not a surprise that some of you are feeling a little bit less confident about quality, because it's a hard thing to decide about. And that's why we need to hang out with our colleagues. And the next information tells you a little bit more about that, which is to say that the thing that you use to help you make decisions, again, really good shout out to all of the leaders in this, is this support from your coordination team. So your educational leader and your coordinator team, your leaders in practice. And that's a really great opportunity to learn and grow. So when you're making some of those decisions that you're less confident about, fantastic to see that you are getting in touch with your coordination team. But that's not all, everybody. You are actually also getting support from your colleagues. You're reading, which is fantastic. You're going to professional learning like this, which is terrific. And then also lots of you are getting support from your colleagues. So that's really fantastic. We'll keep up the good work there in that space. And it's interesting to note here, and this probably wouldn't be no surprise to you, what gets in the way of you making decisions in your work. And you said, lots of you have said, you're worried about getting it wrong. And I think that's really honest, and I really thank you for that feedback, because I think everyone feels a little bit like that from time to time. Just because you're a professional doesn't mean to say that from time to time you're worried, which is one of the reasons why we want to hang out with our leadership team, our coordination team, to help us understand how we can make decisions and feel more confident about that. Look, generally lots of people have said, a bit of lack of confidence, knowledge, but it's really evident that some of you are worried about getting it wrong, which is one of the reasons why we're having this conversation tonight, so that we can get a bit more confident about how we make decisions, so we can get stronger in that. If you like, we're practicing our decision-making muscle. So we're learning a bit more about it, so that we can get better at that process. Keep the comments coming. Love to hear what you're thinking. Thank you very much for everybody who's able to join us at this time. So great to have you all here. So here's what we're going to talk about. We could talk about this idea for a long time, but we've got quite a powerful panel discussion with some colleagues of yours, and we want to give some really good time for that. But again, you've got that great booklet you can dip into to get some more information. So we're going to think a little bit about decision making generally, the difference between legal decisions and ethical decisions. We're going to sort of have a look at those two ideas. Then we're going to think a little bit about making legal decisions and making ethical decisions. And then we're going to check out the ethical decision-making cycle. I'm going to really encourage you here to check out the booklet, because you probably need to have a little go here, but you also probably need to have another go using the booklet, and dipping into the Early Childhood Australia Code of Ethics as you go is really important as well. So let's crack on and think about the first idea, which is making decisions. So everybody makes decisions. Some of us are really good at it, and some of us are not so good at it. And it's one of the reasons why we practice doing decision making with young children, so that they get practiced at that skill, because it is a skill. It's an everyday skill, and it's choosing what you're going to do today, tomorrow, what you're going to do, what you're not going to do. It often is thought as a simple task, and sometimes it is a simple task, but other times it can be very complex. Those of you who've bought a car any time, you realize that there's too many choices, and you've got to choose different things, including the color and all those things, lots of decisions that you have to make in that context. And if you add the professional layer, if you're a family daycare educator and you're buying a car, got more things to think about. So making decisions involves skills and techniques. So some of the ones that are listed here are really helpful to note. So it requires you to identify what you're making a decision about. You have to think, you have to weigh up things. You might have to brainstorm, with others. You might be doing this with your family. You might be doing this with your friends. In a professional context, slightly differently, because we're getting some different people involved. But you do have to act. A decision helps you act. It's worth noting that the action can be to not act, so not do anything. That is still a decision. And sometimes, in fact, lots of times, because we are relational humans, we live in communities, we should communicate those decisions to other people. We all know what happens if communication does not take place, because someone who decided to drink all the milk and didn't replace it and didn't communicate that means that people come home at the end of the night and there's no milk. So all of those sorts of things that happen in your everyday life. So some of you are really strong decision makers in your everyday life, and some of you have still learning that skill, and you're refining that as you go. Now, we want to take that idea into making professional decisions. And professional decisions is something that you all make. And I want to really emphasize this, to say that you are all professional decision makers. Now, you might have gone, I didn't think of that in relation to myself. But I want to suggest to you tonight that you all are professional decision makers. When you become a family daycare educator, a family daycare leader, part of the coordination team, you are part of a professional space, which means that we accept responsibility, that we are undertaking particular type of work that is funded from the community, and there's expectations on the ways that we make decisions. So people are watching, the community is watching, there's expectations around what we do. So here we're making professional decisions around a particular type of relationship. So it's a specific type of decision making. It involves values. Some of those values are shared by your organisation. It could be the philosophy. It also relies often on legal frameworks and codes that help shape the profession and helps us to then decide the things that we choose or don't choose to do over time. You get better at this the more you do it. So the more you practice the art of decision making, the better you get at it. Now, some of you probably are not as aware of the decisions that you're making as you might be. So we wanted to point out a couple of things that might be the types of decisions that you're making. You're making decisions about lunch boxes. You're making decisions about first aid. You're making decisions about where the puzzle pieces are and where you're going to put the puzzles. You might be taking some children out and about, and you're making decisions about where you go and where you don't go. I'm just said 4 different things, but you can imagine how many decisions are being made for a professional every day. And in fact, we have some research around this, which suggests, not in a family daycare context, but I'm going to suggest that it's the same, that early childhood educators have been found to make over 936 decisions in a 6-hour day. If you are working for longer, you're making more. So no wonder some of you are tired. It is actually a really important thing to think about. We're making lots of decisions, and all of the decisions we're making in this context are professional because they are shaped by the particular expectations that are in this space. It's not like making a decision about whether which shoes you're going to buy, or what shoes you're going to wear today, or whether you will mix up the colours and the whites in the laundry, in doing the laundry. Those are everyday decisions. Some of them are very important, actually. Some of them are very personal, and some of them relate to the well-being of your family, but they are different from the professional decisions that we are making every day. I want you to be absolutely assured, not in a way to overwhelm you, but to build your confidence that you probably already are a professional decision maker. You might just not call yourself that. So it's important for us to identify that the professional decisions that are being made are happening every day, and lots of them. What we want to do here is to make sure that we know the difference between the legal ones and the ethical ones so that we can get better at that process. Now, I want to just say right from the get-go, and it taps into what you said in your responses to the survey, that we don't think that these decisions should be made alone. Sometimes you make them alone, particularly in family daycare, because of the nature of your work. But really, we want to be thinking about making them in collaboration and supported by a number of different spaces, like the regulations and the ideas that I showed you before. I'll just go back a little bit and show you what I mean. Values, the subject matter that you're talking about, your practice skills, your national law and regulation, your service policies and procedures, and I think the Early Childhood Australia Code of Ethics all shape these decisions that you are making. So we want to explore that a little bit so we've got a really good understanding of what we mean by the types of decisions that we make. So let's get going and have a look at the difference between the legal decisions we make and the ethical decisions we make. So we can broadly describe the decisions that we make in two categories. The first one is all of the legal decisions that you make. Now, these are the decisions that have been guided by or expected or required by the law and the national regulations. So those things are very important and required of educators. So in fact, you are required to do them, to make those decisions. You don't have a choice in those, because to not make them and to not comply with that means that you will be breaching the law and the regulations. And some of you might have had experience of that situation. You might not have meant to do that, but in fact, what you've ended up doing is making a decision that is not compliant under the law. So you are guided by that, but you are most certainly required to act within the law. And there's a set of those decisions that need to be made, which of course are found in the law and the regulations, and very often they're found in the policies and procedures that you have in your family daycare service. So that's one of the reasons why it's very important that we are aware of some of those. And of course, your leadership team is going to help you understand that. Now, the other set of decisions that educators are making on a daily basis is everything else. So it's all of the other things that you're deciding that don't have a law behind them particularly, or a particular legal expectation. So what colour paint you use, or indeed where you buy your paint, is something that is an ethical decision, not a legal decision. So choosing to set up a space where families can sign their children in is a legal requirement. So choosing and deciding how that process will be done is a legal requirement. So you can see that there are lots of different decisions on a daily basis. Just think about the over 900 decisions that we mentioned before. A large chunk of those are going to be legal because they are going to be required under the law, and a large section of those are going to be ethical. And there might be more legal ones one day, more ethical ones the next day, but it depends on what's happening on that day. What we must be really clear about is that the legal decisions must be made, and they must be compliant with the law and the regulations, and therefore there is more requirement and constraint on those decisions. And in the ethical space, a little bit more freedom to choose different things. We've got to know the difference between the two. So let's just have a bit of another think about that. Legal decisions, of course, can be found, and indeed the guidance for those legal decisions can be found in the documents that you know really well. So if you don't know these documents, I'm sure you're going to be learning more about them and talk to your leadership team about that. If you're leaders, then you're most certainly talking about these on a regular basis. And we do want to have them out and about, so we're all looking at them all the time. What are they? They're the Guide to the National Quality Standard and the Guide to the National Quality Framework, a nice big book here that some of you have got in hard copy, but probably lots of you are looking at the online one, which I do think is very it's helpful to have that, because it's changing often. So the law sometimes changes, and we have to make sure that we keep up to date with the changes. That's why it's great to look at the document online. You can find that at the ASEQA website. If you don't know where that is, then I would make sure you check that out, and maybe you should tab it so that you know that it's always there and you can go and check if you are in doubt. This is how you help to become more confident. I must tell you, I don't remember all of the things that are in that document because it's too big. I have to go in there all the time and check and double check so that I can make sure that I am confident in the decisions or the things that I support people to make decisions about. And of course, there are policies and procedures. They're the law and the regulations. You have copies of those. Again, they do change from time to time. So it's good to be able to go to the ASEQA website and see what those look like. But the guidance material helps you understand what those look like. Sometimes when you read legal documents, it's a bit tricky to read them, but it's helpful if you go to the guiding documents, because then they help to explain what you're meant to be doing in everyday practice. And of course, policies and procedures are also a really good way to be able to understand what it is that you're required to do. So learning a bit more about what's in the policies and procedures. Now, we know that sometimes policies are quite long, so it's great to be able to sit down with a colleague and then talk a little bit more about what they mean so that you're really clear. And one thing that I would really recommend everybody does is ask lots of questions. So no dumb questions in our conversations here. We always like to ask really good questions about what we're doing, what it means, so that you can get clarification about some of those things as you progress. And then the ethical decisions, as I said, are all the other things that you do. What sort of celebrations you might choose to celebrate in your home. You might make some decisions about how much time you spend inside or outside. So all of those decisions are not going to be found in the legal components, but are going to be guided by the ethical decisions that you make. And what are we talking about there? Talking about the relationships that we have with children and families, the community more broadly, and your colleagues, and indeed yourself as a professional. So a little bit less prescribed, I would say. And a good way to think about that is all of the decisions that are outside of the law have an ethical component. So we're going to talk a bit more about this, but we want to make sure that those are honouring the rights and best interests of children, which of course is a guiding principle in the law and the National Quality Standard. So helpful also to just think a little bit more about this. And let's just take a little bit of a look here, because this will help to clarify if what we've talked about still isn't quite clear to you. So again, the legal decisions, the decisions that are required by family daycare educators under the law and the national regulations. And you might see those, as we said, in the form of a policy or a procedure, and they'll be found in the National Quality Guide, Framework Guide, and they'll be found in the law and regulations themselves. So let's take some examples. The information you need to collect about children when they commence care. So you need to have information about who's their legal guardian. You need to have clarity around the numbers of children in care, their ages, etc. So you need to be very clear about that. That is not an ethical decision, that is a legal decision. Medical requirements for children. There's a whole raft of information in the guide about that, and you will have policies and procedures also that you need to follow. Attendance records, accident records, safe environments, Some of the things that have been covered by PD in your pocket up until now, including safe sleep and risk management, are all part of the legal decisions that you make. It's also sometimes helpful to sort of go through this with your colleagues and say, is that, think of a decision you're making and say, is that a legal decision or is that an ethical decision? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that so it gets even clearer in your mind. You might want to think of an idea right now, a decision that you're making, and think, is that a legal decision or is it an ethical decision? Some of you might say, I think it's both, Catherine. Hold on a second. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Ethical decisions, everything else. So all the other decisions that you're making as a family daycare educator. How are you going to welcome the children? Are you going to hold a welcome event for the families that you're getting to know? And when will that be? Will that be on a Tuesday? Will it be in the evening? What are you going to do? That's your decision. Now, some of those decisions might have a legal component, because if you're going to do something that might be a risk to children, you might have to think about managing that risk, and you might be having to make sure that there's medical requirements for that particular child. So you might say the numbers of children that you take, you might decide, so the numbers of children are a legal decision, but in terms of the numbers of children you accept at different age groups, you might say, I prefer to have children who are younger, or I might prefer to have some school-age children from time to time. So that's a decision that you're making about how the type of house you have, your own children, the different types of things. It's more of a relational or contextual decision. Creating documents with children. You might have an approach to using the materials and resources with children that has a particular flavour. You might like to write some of that in your first language. You might like to encourage families to write in their first language. Whether you use recycled materials or natural products rather than buying things from a catalogue. So these are all ethical decisions, not legal decisions. Now, sometimes there's a little bit of both in there, and I think that's sometimes where we get a little bit confused, and that's also where the more we are making those decisions and talking to our colleagues about them, the clearer we can be. It's most likely that there will be situations where there are two things happening, both legal and ethical, which is one of the reasons we need to know what the difference is so that we can start making those decisions in a really strong way. Let's take children's birthdays, for example. We could talk for ages about children's birthdays. It is an example of where both occur. So the legal part of it is compliance with food and beverage requirements in your particular service and the regulations around that. Compliance with risk management and assessment, particularly if children are allergic or there's some other things that are going on in terms of if you're going to have, fire with a candle, you might want to make some decisions about that. You might want to be compliant with policies for dealing with medical conditions for some particular children. There might be other requirements that families have indicated to you that are important to them and are legal requirements. Now, ethically, once you've taken care of all of those things, ethically, you're thinking, well, will we all celebrate children's birthdays? Does everybody have to be there? What happens if one child turns 5 on one day and their friend is not there? Do we do it again? Will there be gifts? Do you do gifts? And, we could talk about that for ages. Is that a good thing or not a good thing? Some of you going, no gifts. And some of you going, yes, well, we really like that. We make a present for one child, everybody else comes in to do that, and we all celebrate together. Some of you might have positions around things that are, in terms of your nutrition policies. You might decide to particularly focus on sometimes food or always food. You might want to decide that. You might be deciding that some things are legal decisions around allergies, etc. So therefore you choose to do some things that are slightly different for a birthday cake. So a whole range of conversations there. Can the families bring party food? What's the policy? Is there a policy? There might be a policy, but there might not be a policy. If there's no policy, then you're going to have to make decisions about what's required. Now, in relation to that, you might actually raise some issues with your leadership, and the leadership team might say, we actually haven't got a decision about that. We're going to decide to let you decide what you think is important, or we're going to come up with some recommendations or some advice about that. It's not a policy, but more like some guidance in terms of practice. What do we do if families don't celebrate birthdays? How do we communicate with them? Do we say we're going to do that, or do we invite them anyway? I don't know what we do. What's respectful? And that's where going back into the code of ethics gives us some guidance about respect and building relationships with people that ensure that their ways of knowing and being are honoured and taken account of. So you can see here there's legal elements about children's birthdays and ethical elements. One thing that would be really helpful, I think, to note here is that it's important as a matter of first principles that we take care of the legal requirements right up front, because that's what you're required to do under the law. So you need to be aware of the decisions that you're making in that context, and then quickly move to the ethical decisions that you might be making around something like birthdays. Now, the reality is that sometimes you're going to be in a situation where you have to make these decisions pretty quickly. But ideally, what you want is to give yourself time to think about these things. So don't really decide about something that you're going to do tomorrow, today. So give yourself some time to think about some of these things and talk to your colleagues about it, because we know that's how you're helped to make decisions, talking to your colleagues. So use some of that support that you've got around you to have a plan for where you're going, so that you make sure that you're taking account of the legal decisions and acting accordingly, and also being mindful of the ethical elements that are in that space. So let's have a little bit of a look at the types of legal decisions that you're making, because let's just be really specific about that. So the legal decisions are determined by some very clear documents that ought to be things that you're thinking about. We've mentioned them before, but it is worth saying again. And I know some of these are really big. They're very big documents, and some of them are written in language that's not easy to access. But that's one of the reasons why we have policies and procedures, and that's why we have some people to help, which is your leadership team and coordinators and leadership teams who are joining us today. You might also be thinking, well, how can we make these a little bit more accessible so that families, family daycare educators can really see how to use these in a reasonable and regular way? Looking at them together is really helpful, I think, but this is most definitely what we are guided by. It is an expectation for you as a family daycare educator that you are guided by and you comply with these documents. So figuring out how you are going to engage with them is a very important professional decision. You don't have to remember them all. Remember, I said that before. I don't remember them all. I've got to go in there and check them on a regular basis. So you've got to know where they are and how to find the parts that you're looking for, and then you use them on a regular basis. So one of the things that I want to say here is really make sure you're reading your policies and procedures on a regular basis, and they will get renewed and reviewed from time to time. Make sure you're part of it so that you know what that is. Because when you sign and say, yes, I'm aware of those, and yes, I comply with those, then that is, you are recognizing yourself as a legally compliant family daycare educator. And if something should happen, let's hope it doesn't, there will be questions asked. Did you know about that policy? Yes, you signed it and you said you did, and then this happened. So we want to be able to be very confident that we know what's in these documents. Another example of a legal decision is the way we record visitors to the family daycare residence. So this is an example of something that you would find in the documents that I just mentioned. So here's a regulation. I'm not going to read this whole entire regulation, but essentially we do have expectations that you, as family daycare educators, and no doubt you've had a conversation with your colleagues about this, you record the visitors to the family daycare residence. Sometimes family daycare, the laws associated with family daycare do change from time to time. We've just had some updates in very recent times. So there's expectations here that the approved provider, so you've got an approved provider of a family daycare service, takes all reasonable steps to ensure that there's a record kept of all the visitors to family daycare. They might be talking to you a little bit about how that might be done, and there's protocols and processes. A family daycare educator must keep a record of all the visitors that come to their family daycare residence. So this, of course, will be no news to you. You know this process. There's some templates that are often available. I've put in here a risk assessment and management tool from Asequa. There's other types of templates that you can have a look at. And of course, your approved provider might also have some templates that you can use so that you can more easily be compliant. Here's another example of a legal decision: the conduct of risk assessments for transportation of children. Now, this has changed significantly in recent times, and there's some different arrangements and different requirements under the law. And in fact, there are opportunities for you to do ongoing professional learning in this space. So some of the transportation of children conversations are really important in recent times because we know children are at risk. So here we go. Regulation, got a number here, 102C. You don't have to remember that. But what we have to do is remember that there is some requirements for me as I transport children. So going and having a look at some of the material that's in the actual regulations, but also looking at some of the advice and other support materials that are available on the Asequa website. So this is another example of a very important risk assessment for transportation of children, legal decision that you must make. So a risk assessment for the transportation of children is by or arranged by the Education and Care Service must, and there's a couple of requirements: identify and assess the risk, and also specifically talk about how the identified risks will be managed. If you do have a compliance visit and a visit from your authorised officers from the Department of Education in New South Wales or any other jurisdiction, you will be required to show evidence of some of the decisions that you have been making under the law. So they will ask for those details should they be required. We've got to know where they are, and they should, of course, be up to date, and their records should be available for anyone to see. And that's an important because it shows that you have gone through the process and you are compliant. Now, there is a number of other requirements in under the law and the regulations. In fact, that whole guidance material that is available in the National Quality Framework Guide is a really important way to understand what those are. But of course, what's going to be happening for a family daycare educator is that you've got this amazing team around you in the service team, the coordination team, who's helping you to understand what is required. And I know at times it feels like there's lots of things to remember, but that's one of the reasons why we have that guiding material and we have other people to assist us as we're thinking through some of these decisions. So hopefully those two decisions are things that you do every day. So congratulations, you are professional legal decision makers and you're making those decisions regularly, and hopefully lots of you knew this. So at this point, you might be saying, I'm going to put that in the connect column because that's connecting with something I already know. The extending part might be, actually should know where those things are, shouldn't I? I should put them somewhere so that I know where that guidance material is. I want to know where the regulations are. I'm going to tab it on my computer. And some of these also might challenge you because you might be thinking, I'm actually not sure that I know all of what's required, in which case you might want to put an action already to make sure you have a conversation with your family daycare coordination unit to see whether you can understand a bit more about what's required. So if that's the legal decisions, we should just talk a little bit about ethical decisions. So ethical decisions, remember, that's everything else. And it's really important that as we think about ethical decisions, we actually think about what ethics is. So ethics is answering a very important question, and bear with me here because we're going to use language that's a little bit unusual. What ought I do? Now, ought is not a word that everybody uses all the time, but it's an important word here because it describes a difference between what you should do and what you have to do in the law, the legal decisions that you make. This decision and this word is about what is right to do. So ought is a word, quite an old-fashioned word, that describes the things that are right to do. Whenever you are faced with the decision about what is right to do, you are dealing with ethics, the decisions you are making about the right thing to do in relation to children, families, the community more broadly, and indeed your colleagues. So ought is a really interesting word here. I'm going to ask you, that might go in that challenge column, I'm going to ask you to bear with me here on that word because It helps us to distinguish from should, like I said before. We need another word because ethics is not what you should do. Ethics is what you ought to do or what is right to do. So another way of thinking about that decision, about what I ought to do, is that you're often choosing between two good things. It's good to buy new resources for children. It's also good to recycle and to buy upcycled materials. You have to decide which good you ought to do, which is the right one to do. Now, sometimes that decision is really hard and you'll make one decision and you think, that wasn't as good as the other one, and you will go back and you will change it. In the legal context, you can't really change it because it is very clearly described and prescribed. In this space, you are often choosing between what's important, or what's significant, what is good, and what is really good or perfect. Do you speak up? Do you remain silent? Do you celebrate or not celebrate? You're often choosing between two good things. But let's think about this in terms of the legal decisions. Sometimes you are legally required to speak up, thinking about children who have some child protection context, and you might have policies and procedures in place around that. So you can't remain silent. But sometimes you decide, I'm not going to say that out loud. Even though I'm thinking it, I'm not going to say it out loud to a family member or a colleague, a family or a colleague, because that's not helpful and it's not the right thing to do. So again, decisions will be made between two good things. And this is where the ought comes in, not the should. The should is what you're required to do. The ought is a conversation around what is right to do. So again, really strange word. And I'm just going to, go back to that word just to remind you what it is. So ought, it's this word called ought. So what ought I do? What is right to do? That's a good way of thinking about it. You might want to write that down because it's always helpful to learn new things and learn new words to describe what we experience. And of course, for us in early childhood education, we've got a playbook that helps us figure out what our ethical decisions might look like. And that is the Early Childhood Australia Code of Ethics. And I was very privileged to be a part of that process in 2016 when we rewrote the Code of Ethics for more contemporary times. You could say we probably need to do it again because we're now in a post-COVID world, and it's something that we would probably need to revisit. But really helpful, I think, to think about what that might look like. And of course, ethics are also something that is guided by the principles in the National Quality Framework as well. And hopefully you know these really well. It is in the law, but it very much talks to the types of decisions that you might be making as you progress and think about the work that you do every day. So I'm going to urge you to have a look at those because they'll help you make the decisions about what is right to do. It is right to think of children as successful and competent and capable. It is right to be welcoming of diversity. It is right to celebrate and recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives and so on. But let's have a little look at some of the things that you might be making ethical or ought decisions about, what is right to do. One question is, and it's always with a question, I can say, so it'll be a question that you're trying to answer. Where will I buy my resources? Will I buy them from the fantastic catalogue with modern teaching aids? There's so many things I can buy there. It's extraordinary. Or am I going to go to the op shop and find different things that are from recycled and upcycled? You decide. Now, both of those are good. So you've got to decide, what ought I do? What's the right thing to do today? Because the right thing to do today might be different from what you do next week or next year. And we can find some of the advice in here in terms of the National Quality Framework, and the National Quality Standard has got some ideas in here. They're not necessarily prescribing what you absolutely have to do, but there might be some decisions that you make that are supported by these ideas. And of course, lots of the time you're having these conversations with your colleagues and with your leadership team. So you can decide and talk about the fact that you might do a combination, and you might make some decisions that are responsive to the community that you're part of. Because you might decide that the right thing to do is to use your money in a particular way, but you also might have a partnership with a particular provider. So Another one, which is a really big one, which we haven't got time to talk about in huge detail, but something that is picked up in the National Quality Standard, not necessarily a legal requirement for you to celebrate particular celebrations, but we know that a legal requirement to participate in the National Quality Standard is required, but what you decide to do on a day-by-day basis is indeed your decisions and how you decide what you ought to do, what is right to do. One big question, what will we celebrate? Will we celebrate Chinese New Year? Will we celebrate Diwali? Will we celebrate Christmas? What are we going to do? Easter's coming up. What do we do? Do we do that? Do we celebrate that? Who do we ask? How do we make that decision? What is the right thing to do? And we've got some guidance in here, but at the end of the day here, family daycare educators alongside their leadership team make some decisions about the right thing to do, which is different from your legal requirements. So some celebrations, of course, have a whole range of different aspects to them that will require thinking about. And lots of different people will be able to think about ways that you might do that. But it does require a big bit of thinking as you progress in your conversations. So you can see here, we've talked a bit about the legal decisions that we've made, and we've talked about the types of ethical decisions we make. And I just wanted to reiterate one more time that in fact, we're often making legal and ethical decisions at the same time. So we're making ethical decisions and legal decisions. There are components of both in many things we do. Sometimes they're very clearly separate, but often they are connected. So here's another really good example that we know comes up all the time: sleep. So legal and ethical decision. There's some very significant legal requirements. In fact, there's a PD in your pocket about that. Have a look at that. And there's some really great resources that you can have a look at. So there are codes and expectations in regulations and requirements for the way you conduct sleep for children, risk assessments, the types of cots, etc. Lots of information about that. And some of that will be in policies and procedures that you are required to abide by. And that will be something that an authorised officer, should they come to your home in doing a compliance check, will want to look at and note that is happening. Then there is ethical components around sleep. Discussions with families about sleep preferences and practices. When the timing of sleep, waking children up, that's a huge one that's been around for a long time in early childhood education. Should we wake children up after their 35-minute sleep, or is it the right thing to do to let them sleep longer? And then families say to you, but they're awake until 11 o'clock at night. What is the right thing to do? Now, we have an ethical commitment to act in the best interest of children, but sometimes it's going to be right for us to help children manage their sleep in a different way. It's right to listen to families, and it's also right to make sure that we are guided by children's rights and best interest. So the legal part is what we're required to do in terms of sleep, and the ethical component is what we are required to do in terms of our relationships, or what we ought to do, or what is right to do in relation to the children and families that we work with, and indeed our colleagues. So you will no doubt have something that's on your mind at the moment that is something that you've been thinking a bit about, that you might say, actually, I've got a good example, in which case I just want you to make a little note of that, because after our panel discussion, which we're about to see, we're going to come and look at the ethical decision-making cycle, and that will help us understand how to make a decision, because it's good to know what the decisions are and then figure out what they look like as we progress. So what we're going to do now, everybody, is we're going to hear from an amazing panel discussion. And it was my absolute pleasure to hang out with a group of amazing people, and they'll be introduced to you shortly, who can help us to think about the ethical decision-making processes and the legal decision-making processes that they make every day, but also to help us understand what they look like. So it's a little bit of a while, this panel discussion, but it's really rich in conversation. So grab yourself a cup of tea and piece of paper, so note down some things you want to think about, and I'll see you in just a moment after we hear from this great panel discussion.
Decisions in family daycare. The panelists in this discussion are Dr. Ann Kennedy, Sharon Foran, the manager of Ballina Byron Family Day Care. Kylie McGovern, Family Day Care Educator, also from Ballina Byron Family Day Care. And the interview and presenter is Catharine Hydon.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Catharine Hydon and welcome to our panel discussion as part of the PD in Your Pocket series brought to you by New South Wales Family Day Care Association. This panel discussion welcomes three distinguished guests in a bit of a different format for PD in Your Pocket, where we're going to have a panel discussion. So we really welcome the participants who are joining us tonight to pull up a chair, get a cup of tea, and feel like you're part of the discussion about what it means to be a professional decision maker. So I'm going to ask these lovely people, and I'll introduce them in a moment, to share their insights about being a professional decision maker. You know, how can we make the choices that are in the best interests of children and their families, and how can we sort of navigate that? And we'll be talking a little bit also about some practicalities and some big thinking. So feel free to take notes, and you'll be able to also come back and have a think about some of these things as we progress through PD in Your Pocket. So let me introduce you to these amazing people. We're firstly joined by Dr. Anne Kennedy. Good, hello. I was going to say good at morning, but actually, who knows when it is? Hello, Anne. Anne's a consultant, mentor, writer, researcher in early childhood education, and a great friend and advocate for early childhood education in Australia. So welcome, Anne.
Thanks, Catherine. Lovely to be with everyone and with the panel members.
And also we're joined by Sharon Foran, who is the manager at Ballina Byron Family Day Care. And Sharon, I believe you have 30 years experience in family day care.
I do. It makes me sound really old, doesn't it? Yeah.
Wise.
I've had all the roles in family day care. I've been an educator, I've been a coordinator, I've been an assistant manager, and now for the last 10 years I've been a manager. So yeah, I'm really excited and quite honoured to be in the company of you and Anne. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, likewise, Sharon, we're very excited that you're here. And very importantly, we are joined by a family daycare educator who does this on a daily basis. So it's very important that we think about the practical and practice components of decision making. So hello, Kylie McGovern, how are you? It's fantastic that you can be here. And I understand that you've been working in early childhood education for about, 12, 13 years, but you're now joined Ballina Byron Family Day Care in the last year or so. Is that right?
Hi, Catherine. Thanks for having me on board today. Yes, I've recently transitioned from long day care to family day care. I've been operating for almost a year now and really enjoying the change in my career. So thank you for having me on board.
It's fantastic that you can be here, and what a great way of thinking about your early childhood career. In fact, that you could spend some time working in a centre-based setting and then some work in family daycare. So a great thing that we're able to do. So I want to start with Anne, and I'm going to get Anne to help us understand the art of decision making, because I'm not sure whether it's something that we talk about all the time, that people are going to make decisions, and some of our participants here and you will also no doubt recall that when we started developing the updated the early years learning framework and then the updated framework, we are sort of deeply in that space. We're thinking about the way that people make decisions about what they do. So can you start us off, Anne, by saying, why is it important to be an effective decision maker in family daycare?
Yeah, I'm going to come at it from a different angle, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think what's at the heart of it is that when you're working as a family daycare educator or any other educator in any other setting, you're working as a professional. And professionals have to make decisions. You're not on a production line making sausages. If you're on a production line making sausages, you don't make any decisions, really. You follow instructions. And it would be dangerous indeed for you to decide to do something different on that production line. But when you're working with children and families and colleagues, you're acting as a professional. And that's one of the hallmarks of being a professional, is that you make decisions and the decisions are important because they don't just impact you or the sausages, they impact children, families, communities, colleagues. And so it's the fact that you have to make them as a professional, and it's the fact that it has enormous impact And sometimes those decisions are small and the impact might not be great. You know, it really doesn't matter to the children much if there's red paint or blue paint. But if you decide not to have paint at all, you know, maybe that is a breach of what children really have a right to. And that's probably not such a good example, but the impact of the decisions you make. And Sharon has to do that as a coordinator. Kylie has to do it every day, but they're really important decisions that the scheme makes and that the educator makes each day. Yeah.
So, and how do you get better at it? You know, like, do you just, you know, all of us here have, you know, done pre-service education. We've got qualifications. Lots of our people who are listening here are either developing their qualifications. They've got lots of experience. Is it just a matter of sort of more knowledge, or is it experience? How do you get better at it?
It's a really good question. And hats off to Family Daycare for thinking about focusing on it, because I think it's one of those practices that we just do. Oh, you know, make a decision about this and we don't even think about it. It becomes almost automatic, except when it's something out of the ordinary a bit, then we might stop. So I think spending this time in this PD to just sort of think, yeah, actually I do make decisions every day, big ones and small ones, and those decisions are having an impact. And so I think for me, to get better at it, you need, you know, particularly when we're talking about the bigger decisions, you need to be well informed. So you need to think about what are the pros, what are the cons, who's benefiting from this, who wouldn't. That sort of feel like you know the issue inside and out before you jump in to make a quick decision. And sometimes you have to make quick ones. I think sometimes it's helpful to seek help from somebody else. So if you've been wrestling with a decision and you're not quite sure, will I do this or that, talk to someone you trust, a mentor or another colleague or someone outside the sector even, if you feel they could give you some advice and some sort of perspective. And I think another important thing is to kind of document those decisions, write them down, keep a journal, keep a diary. That's your professional kind of record of where you've been, how you got there and why you made that decision. And it's good to be able to look back at it and see the growth in your own decision making. That's just some of the things that I think are important.
I can see you nodding, Kylie. Why do you think writing down your decision is a good idea?
Yeah, it's something that I do very regularly. I keep a diary and keep notes of my thinking and my challenges and decisions that I'm working on, short-term, long-term, so that I can come back and reflect on decisions I've made in the past, point of reference for future decisions, record for future communication with management coordinators, and it helps in the long term as well as in that moment to be able to reflect on decisions I've already made, and to think about future growth.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Anne. I think it really helps people to get a bit of a sense of how you do it. Whether, you know, we don't want to think that it's just something that happens, you know, one day you get to be a good decision maker. I think, you know, how long have I been working in early childhood education? 35 years. I feel like I'm still practicing. You know, you're still developing the skills. And I think it is really important for us here to also consider that those decisions that you're making are the very stuff of the accountabilities that we have through the National Quality Standard, and are great to be able to talk about when you have an assessment and rating visit, is to say, I made this decision, this is what happened. Even if the decision wasn't quite right, it's great to be able to say, I made that decision, I learnt from it, and this is how we're progressing. And of course, if you have that resource and available, like you said, Kylie, you can go back and have a look. And just before we go to Sharon, just to talk a little bit about what it means to be a leader in this space, we are investigating in this PD in your pocket the difference between legal decisions and ethical decisions. So we just need to sort of sort out that a little bit. And you're saying that there's professional decisions. So are professional decisions made up of both? Can you just take us through that? You know, how do we understand that?
Yeah, and yes, they are made up of both sometimes. They overlap at times. So let's start with the legal decision making. That's, in some ways, that's quite clear cut, because it's governed by the rules and we're mandated to do certain things. So we can't make it up. We can't go, oh, well, you know, I think I won't keep accident records, you know. I don't think they're necessary. I can just tell the parent. We can't, that's not a decision we have a right to make. And you use the word accountability. So I would see the legal decisions are kind of the accountability framework. And sometimes it's really helpful to have that. That can be helpful for an educator to say to a family, well, no, we can't smack them. We're not allowed under our regulations. That's not an option for us. We have a different way of working with children. So the legal requirements, no argument, we must do it. So they're actually they can be stressful, you know, when you're talking about, say, notification to child protection. That's a stressful time, but there is, you know, there's that mandated obligation. You know what you have to do. You've been trained in it. You've done all your child safe organisation work. You've trained up in mandatory reporting, and you just follow the process. But at the same time as that's happening, there's an ethical kind of decision making that's going on. That's about, okay, here's a family in crisis. I have to make a notification, but how am I going to support them through this? How am I going to keep them engaged in the service that I'm offering? Because that's a good place for the child and often a good place for the family as well. So always, you know, not every ethical area will have a legal element to it, but often I think all the legal stuff has a ethical. So even, you know, reporting to a parent about an accident, okay, you've done your legal bit, it's in the accident book, you've signed it, but you have that obligation then to share that with the family, and you're conscious of the family's reaction and you want to support them. So that's beyond what the legal is. You don't just say, here's the report, on your bike, off you go. You say, oh, look, this happened, and, you know, and you talk the family through what happened, what you did, what the outcome's been as far as you can see, and asking them to follow up if it needs follow up. So yes, they are different decisions. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they're completely separate. But I think sometimes we do get a bit confused about that. And so we talk about ethical dilemmas. There's the other one, but a dilemma is when you've got two things that are both good. And sometimes people say an ethical dilemma is a choice between smacking a child and not smacking. No, that's not a dilemma. That's a legal requirement not to smack. An ethical dilemma is more like a parent says, I don't want my child to have a nap. I'm absolutely certain about that. On the other hand, you're seeing the child and you're witnessing the child getting fatigued, really tired, and not able to cope with what's happening in the afternoon. So somehow or other, you've got to have that decision-making process with the parent or the carer around how can we do this in the child's best interest. That's the way I always go back to what's in the child's best interest, because it's very difficult to say, look, I'm in partnership with families, I follow all that, you know, their recommendations, their advice, and then go against that. Sometimes we might need to work with them to get them to see it from another perspective, and that's the ethical dilemma. So nothing we do should diminish a family's expertise in their own child, but sometimes we have to support them in that work to see something from a different perspective. That's the ethical bit. The legal bit, I think, is reasonably straightforward, clear cut, can be challenging, but sometimes it's a relief that it's there.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, are the tools that you need to know the difference the same as what you said before? You know, is it about, you know, talking to other people so you can clarify what the difference is? You know, is it the same?
Well, I presume every family daycare scheme has protocols around certain things.
Policies and procedures,
Policies and procedures, so you need to know those, you need to be familiar, and they'd be part of induction, Sharon, I presume. And they probably looked at every now and again and refreshed and have that professional knowledge. rely. Yes, you might check something with a colleague, with Sharon, or with somebody else, with your manager.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to make a notification, whatever, and I'm just need a bit of support for myself here, and this is how I'm going to do it. And documenting is absolutely essential, particularly with the legal stuff. But I think, as you know, Kylie said, keeping a record of your thinking is helpful.
Really good.
And it's professional. I mean, you don't go to a doctor and he hasn't got notes about, or she hasn't got notes about you. You know, if you came in and the doctor's looking at it thinking, who the hell are you? Like, I think there are professional doctors. They're not necessarily shared with anyone else. They can be, but they don't have to be.
And they don't have to be slick and gorgeous. They are just sort of so that you can remember what you're doing, so that you can clarify.
Yeah. The only other thing, I think there's a lot of good resources, and I think that Ethics in Action, the book that you and I, Lenny wrote, I think there's really good practical stuff in that if people do a deeper dive into ethical versus legal and dilemmas, etc.
Yeah. And of course, we've got these amazing resources from the ASEQA website, as well as all of your local resources, which are developed, including those policies and procedures. So thank you, Anne, for that. You know, I think it's really helpful to sort of clarify what we're talking about. Sharon, we've got to come to you now and say, okay, so in that context, as a leader in family daycare, you're helping your team make decisions, you're making decisions. How did you become and how do you support other people to become great at that process in your experience?
Look, I mean, I just think that you have to have a really strong understanding of governance and leadership. That's really important from the very beginning, and also understand and put practices in place that support our understanding of the framework, support our understanding of the regulations and the law. And how we do it at Ballina Byron Family Day Care is it comes from the very top. It comes from our very committed committee that all have early childhood knowledge and understanding of the National Quality Framework and what their role and responsibility is in running and managing a service. Then it comes down to me that I'm the one that implements it, the one that supports it. And I've always said, and my team make me look good. And they really do, because our team, from our committee to myself through to our coordination unit, our administration staff and our educators all understand their roles and their responsibilities, because what we've put in is a very strong induction from the very beginning. We have a really sound induction. Our policies reflect the regulations, the law, and also the standards, and that enables us then to always fall back onto those in the respect of if an educator needs someone, there is always someone there to support them, whether it be myself, their coordinator, or our administration manager. There's someone there to be able to say, okay, this is where you'll find that information. How can I support you to understand this better? How can I support you to have that difficult conversation with a family or a notification, but still supporting the family in that respect? We also encourage our educators to be critically reflecting on these things at all times. Critical reflection, when we say it to educators, and even when we say it in that, to us in the coordination unit, we all put our hands over our head and wait for the boom. But critical reflection can be really difficult. But if we keep doing it, like as Anne said, reflecting on what our practices are and making them better the next time around, we don't always do them great the first time. And I'm after, 32 years in this role, I don't always do them great either, but I learn from it each time. And then we put that into practice a little bit better next time.
Very wise words to, really encourage us to think deeply, and which is why those tools are really important, and recording some of our decisions. Sharon, can you talk a little bit about some of the legal decisions that your family daycare educator team are making under the law on a daily basis? Can you just give us a couple of examples?
Like, I mean, one that's a prime example at the moment is justification of childcare subsidy. I mean, that's a really big legal obligation that our educators have to receive, have to, invoice, have to receive electronic transferring of money. It's not that here's $50 and on the old days, and can I owe you 10 for next week.
Yeah.
It has to be done more precisely now. We all have to be more accountable for that. So that's really important for our educators to understand the importance of being compliant, and making sure that, we're having a great understanding and relationship with families so they understand that obligation and that responsibility. I mean, we've just been through rating and assessment, and the understanding of, the reason why we get rated and assessed is that we're meeting those 7 areas, that we are contributing along the lines to governance and leadership. Sometimes educators go, oh, that's your role as the coordination unit, but it's not. It's all of our roles to be compliant in governance and leadership. And we're all leaders in our own rights. Some educators find it really difficult, like Anne was saying about the sleep. That's the regulations state that children, if they're tired, they have the right to sleep, to rest. But a parent says, no, please don't. They don't go to bed until 10 o'clock at night. So it's not only an ethical decision making there and a role, but it's also illegal. Like, I can't keep a child awake if they're so desperately needing a sleep.
Absolutely.
So that's something on the ground. The biggest, the ones that we find too, with program and practice and how educators, we all know everyone has to program and practice. In Ballina, Byron Family Day Care, we give you the right to do it the way you want to do it, and
you can decide. You can decide how you do it. But what's the decision that you have to make if you are part of Ballina Byron Family Day Care?
That you're meeting the programming cycle. That you're meeting all of the areas in the programming cycle. So as a coordinator and as our educational leader, how we support that is, regular check-ins. Our educators send their program and practice to us and then to our educational leader, and we're ticking it off and making sure that it is meeting that area. So the educators have autonomy in how they do it, but we are also meeting the area 1 in program and practice if they're feeling, they're fulfilling that cycle. So our educators make decisions on a day-to-day basis, as you said, but how we support that is ensuring that we've got really strong management system in place, that educators know where to come if they need support, or they need that that ear, or that that someone that's not connected to it emotionally, but also too along the way we do, we make sure that we do in-service trainings to support those things. We also offer outside training that's there, like PD in your pocket, or it comes from other places as well, to make sure. And we're always checking in, how are you going, how's your decision making going, how's your have you had to do a hard decision in the last week, or since I saw you last?
Yes.
And
why does that help, Sharon? Why does it help for someone to talk through their decision, with you?
Well, I mean, we all know if we have a decision that we need to make, to get someone else's opinion, it's valuable. It enables us to see it from a different perspective, and for us to say, you have to do that. That's a legal requirement of being a family daycare educator. So how can we get that in place and make it work for you?
Yeah, great. And I think one more thing I just want to clarify, policies and procedures, what's the role of those in decision making?
Okay. So as I always say to educators, if you're looking for a regulation, or a law, look at our policies. And they're simply in the policy. For example, our grievance and compliance policy. Okay, you're having a really difficult tussle with a family about something. Where do I go to get something to say, well, it's my legal responsibility to make sure that, you're not coming in under the influence of alcohol and expect me to hand over your child to you. I know my legal right, I haven't got a legal leg to stand on, but, in our policy, this is what, the steps that I would take to ensure the safety of your child. Yeah. So, those policies, our policies have been written, rewritten, and tweaked over the years to make sure that they are in line with the regulations and the law, as well as the standards, to ensure that we are being compliant. So it's a great place for our educators to go.
Absolutely, Sharon. And I think this is a big shout out for all of our participants who are joining us on this webinar, is to make sure that people are engaging with their policies and procedures, which of course, as Sharon has identified, are required under the law, and a way of understanding those locally, so that if there is an expectation within the law that talks about sleep, for example, then procedures and policies around that, policies and procedures in your local setting, help you know what to do as you encounter that situation. So really importantly, if you feel like your policies and procedures are hard to understand and you don't really quite know them, that's a great conversation to have with your the team, the leadership team, is to say, how do I understand this? I'm not sure about it, because policies and procedures can sometimes be a bit clunky. They're really big and no one reads them. So we want to be able to make them very accessible and clear, and hopefully our educators are really supported by that process. Let's keep going. Kylie, hello again. So you've heard from Sharon and Anne, just in terms of the context. Does it feel overwhelming sometimes? I just thought I'd, sort of check in with you. Does it feel like, oh my goodness, there's lots of things that I'm talking about? What does it feel like to you to be a decision maker?
Look, it's a lot. It's a big responsibility every day. And in family daycare, essentially you're on your own. You haven't got any immediate backup. We've got fantastic support from the coordination unit and manager to make quick calls to and get feedback from, and to bounce thinking off. And that's a fantastic point of reference. We're frontline with the families by ourselves. So it's a big responsibility day in, day out, to make sure that we're making the best decisions that we can in the moment and for the big picture. And as Sharon was saying, having policies and procedures in place that are strong and reliable and quickly accessible is really beneficial to pop out and have a quick look at when you need to. We read them regularly, but they're always a quick point of reference to just recap on and to share with families. Our policies and procedures reflect the regulations and the law, so it's a very strong source of documentation to share with families when we need it, and we know that this is the law, this is what we must do. Ethical decision making is a little bit trickier, because it's not as clear cut as the legal decisions, where we have a document that we can pull out and this is the law, this is how it is, even though, as Anne was saying, we need to have the ethical background to those decisions with communicating with families. Having the strong documentation of the regulations and the law and the policies and procedures is much easier, I think, to relay on to families, because that's just how it is. And when we're making ethical decisions, it takes, personally, I believe, a bit more thinking, a bit more problem solving, which can be collaborative as well as reflective on our own parts. So there's a lot within the family daycare setting to consider and to weigh up. As a new educator in this kind of setting, it was a big task to set up and to learn new policies and procedures, and to make sure that I was across it all to be running my own business. And how did you get better at it, Kylie? You've been doing it for nearly a year, did you say? I think it'd be great to hear from you how you got better at decision making. Is it some of the things that Anne was saying about documenting, or is it practice? Sure, it's a combination of a lot of things. I think it's experience is essential for strengthening these skills. Documentation is a big asset to me. I enjoy writing things down and reflecting and thinking things over. And the more I do it, the better I become at it. I'm not always going to get my decision right, I suppose, but I have the right background to try and make the best decision in the best interest of the children at all times. And I have a strong coordination team behind me who help with these decisions. Often I'll call them and bounce my thinking off them to just to see if I'm on the right track with my thinking, to get feedback. They provide prompts and thinking for me to then go away and consider in my decision making. And it's really great to have a great team just a phone call away when I need it. So I think it's something that's always growing. The more decisions we make, the better at it we become. And the more we reflect on those decisions in our critical thinking and documentation, I think the stronger we become at it. So it takes time, and sometimes we reflect and we think, well, I could have done a little bit better here, or I made a really good decision there. And it's all growth.
Yeah. And can you tell us, a little bit about a decision that you've been making just in the last week or so? Maybe it's a difficult one, something that's sort of been on your mind. Just give us a bit of insight. Now, we probably we don't want to sort of know all of the details. We want to protect the privacy of the children and families that you work with, but just a bit of a sense of some of the sorts of decisions that you're making in the last week, maybe the trickier ones.
Yeah, sure. Look, we're constantly making decisions, some bigger ones, some smaller ones within the setting, and some of them are quick and easy decisions. Some of them take a bit more thinking. I have found in my service in family daycare that having a strong induction and orientation process with families has been really beneficial in creating strong communication skills and good connections with families. Open communication has been essential in being able to communicate these things, being, as I said before, that frontline person. So it's myself and the families every day, in that we can talk through some of these sticky questions, I suppose, things where I can use my professional input to have conversations with families, and they respect, because of our good relationships, where I'm coming from, and they appreciate my professional knowledge, and they take it on board when we have these discussions, such as Anne referred to earlier, perhaps with sleep time and rests and children's needs for rest. And we can talk about the law and the regulations, and we can talk about how we see the child. And I always acknowledge that families are the expert in their child. And I can relate to families as a parent myself in children's sleep needs and how it can impact their night, and you're relatable and you can have these conversations honestly and openly. And I think that's been really critical with families throughout my early childhood career, and that we have these conversations openly and honestly. I've got lots of examples of different ethical decisions that I make day in, day out. A lot of them, I suppose, are bigger picture, and they often relate over and over again within the setting. So as I said before.
Like what? Can you give us a little taste of what some of the things you've decided recently about what?
For example, managing illness in family daycare.
Okay, illness, big one at the moment, in terms of coming out of COVID and, the decisions around those things. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that's important to manage well through any early childhood setting.
Yes.
But in family daycare specifically, and it's something that I share with my families during my induction process, and it's something that we're continually talking about, is that I'm operating my service within my home with my own children, and I'm the sole educator. So parents have a good understanding of the impact of children perhaps coming to care unwell, and the cycle of illness within our service means that I may not be able to operate and provide care the following week. Indeed. So it's a conversation.
That's a big one, isn't it?
And having those strong and open communication skills with the families, and good connections and relationships, and reference to our policies and procedures helps us to have those discussions and make good decisions for everyone in the best interest of the children. And
I guess this also suggests that, seems like, that's a very significant one. I think and as we're coming into, winter and, different cycles of colds and flus going through the place, lots of decisions around that. But even the micro decisions that are part of that, are we using tissues, or are we using, what are we doing with those, just in terms of recycling and just the way we use products, all the products that we use, in terms of cleaning products, where are we getting those from? All of those decisions are quite significant. And, the more you think about them, the more you think, well, sometimes I make them and they're good and sometimes I don't. And I make them and they're not so great. I just want to check in with Anne. What about this mistake thing? Like if you make a mistake or you make a decision and you think, oh, that's not the right decision, is there some advice that you can give to our participants here about what happens if you make a mistake or you make an error in your decision making? Is there advice about what to do in that circumstance?
To err is to be human. I mean, I think that's the first principle. We all make mistakes. And I think, we're always saying that to children. It's okay. So we've got to treat ourselves. It's part of our own well-being is to be able to say, I make mistakes sometimes and I regret that, but I've learned from that mistake, as Sharon. A scheme has to learn. Individual educators have to learn from those mistakes. That's the critical bit, that you learn from them. You don't keep repeating them. And I'm fascinated by Kylie and Sharon's conversation, because what came out to me was the importance of the relationships. Relationships matter and make a difference. So Kylie can get, that's an incredibly good example that Kylie gave about decision making around the health business, the sickness story.
Huge.
And what she's built is trust with those families and relationships with those families. And so they start to join the dots. If they bring a sick child in, Kylie gets sick, then there's no family daycare for anyone.
That's right.
That's the shared obligation to children and each other. That's the ethics. That's the ethics of our work. That's why we can't ignore the ethics, because if we ignore the ethics and we just focus on the regulations and the technical stuff, then we'll never bring families with us on as partners in this work.
Exactly.
I just think you can't underestimate that. And I love Kylie's idea. I think she said you're becoming braver with your decisions as you gain experience.
Yeah.
I think it's fair enough if you're just out of training, if you just finished your TAFE. That you'll be a bit conservative with your decision making because you don't want to make too many mistakes, and that's fair enough. But with experience and reflection and more knowledge, then I think you get braver with your decisions.
I guess too, and in that, and Sharon, I'd love you to comment too, is that I think given our regulatory environment, we need to be very upfront and open and transparent if a decision we've made is not correct. Our regulatory authorities want us to be transparent about that. And, let's hope that some of those things don't have dire consequences, but we do need to be as upfront as, and in fact, I think that's what makes you a professional too, is that you are upfront and open about those, and then you rectify them and you take strategies to ensure that they don't happen again, which of course is why our regulators do help us do that. Sharon, do you want to comment about that? Look, how do you support people to sort of get, recover from maybe a decision that's not quite right and then keep going?
Sure. Look, I think if nothing else, which COVID taught me, is that, you really had to think on your feet, and that ever-changing environment and rules and regulations, and keeping on top of those. And I remember, going home and saying, I'm never going to apologise for making a decision that I feel is in the best interest of the children and the families and the educators at the time. And there was sometimes I had to say, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. And as you said, there wasn't dire consequences around that, but then I had to just back off a little bit. And that's what I tell educators. You can't come on and think that you know it all, because you don't. None of us know it all. Like Anne said before, we're all still learning. We're all, we've been in it for all different amounts of times, and we're still learning the ropes. But if we can be collaborative and understand where, our regulations come from and our laws come from, and, ask for help. If one of our coordinators sees something that's not quite right in a service, hopefully our relationships are strong enough to be able to say, hang on a moment, you know, I'm seeing something here, let's have a discussion about it. And that's why I said, you know, from the very beginning, we form really strong relationships with not only our educators, but with our families. Every one of our families have an interview with the coordination unit, and we go through our policies. We go through what your expectations are, what our expectations are, what the educators' expectations are, and how we can all marry that together and work collaboratively for the best interests of the children in care. So there are going to be some, you know, sometimes that we have to go, hang on a minute, this is a really big one and we have to deal with it right now. Or we can say, okay, I'm going to give you a call later. Let's have a discussion about what's going on here and see if we can do it better.
Thank you so much, Sharon. That's a really great piece of advice, I think, is to, you know, to really work collaboratively to make sure that our decisions are in the best interest of children. They are compliant, but they also are relational. They help to continue the really dynamic and I think very special relationship that we have with families and children and our family daycare educators out there in communities all across New South Wales and of course across Australia. So that does bring us to our panel conversation, everybody. You can see by this conversation that we could have talked all day about this really important matter. And we hope that what this has done is given you a little bit of an insight about some of the conversations that you might like to have with your colleagues in your family daycare context. So at another time, you might want to come together in a professional learning space and talk about how you make decisions and what you understand to be the legal and ethical components of that. And we hope that these conversations have helped you understand that a little bit more deeply. Thanks everybody for joining me. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Kylie. And thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Fantastic to hear that great conversation. I hope you enjoyed that. That was quite long. So lots of great conversations and discussions that we had there. And hopefully there was a couple of really interesting ideas in there that have made you think a bit more. So potentially connect with what you already do, policies and procedures, induction, communication. Perhaps there's some ideas that extend, you know, again, induction. How can I make induction a bit more stronger, you know, to make sure that there's lots of great opportunities for me to set the scene for communication moving forward. And also, hopefully there was some discussions in there that extend you a bit further, sort of stretch your thinking in terms of how you've made decisions in the past and how you see yourself as a decision maker, a legal and an ethical decision maker. So great to hear from that conversation. And as you heard me invite you right at the end there, you might want to think about having a conversation like that with your colleagues. So we are now in the process of coming to the end of our PD in Your Pocket event here. But importantly, before we go, we want to set a action for you as something that we would like you to think about in terms of ethical decision-making and decision-making generally, ethical and legal decision-making. So what we're using here is a decision-making cycle that is based on the decision-making cycle that's in the Early Childhood Australia Code of Ethics document that Anne talked about before. And also it's fairly common process to think about making a professional decision that would be guided by a process, a step-by-step process. And this is it. So I just want to talk you through this ethical decision-making cycle or decision-making cycle to help us understand how to go through a process. And my challenge to you is to use the decision-making cycle in your own practice, is to think about how you take a decision through a process, a step-by-step process. You'll find this in the booklet, so you can go and have a bit of a look in there and use that. In fact, I would encourage you to get together and talk about some of the things, just like you heard Kylie talk about that she was making decisions about. Sickness in your family daycare home, how do you manage that? So again, using a very real life example is very powerful. So as you can see right from the beginning, you can see here that you start with the section right at the top where you've got an opportunity to identify whether a decision is legal, here we go, legal here, or ethical. And that's the decisions and conversation we've just had with Anne and the team, and what I've talked about before. Is it a legal decision, in which case it's something that you're required to do, that you must do, as Anne said, fairly clear cut, abide by the law, policies and procedures. So you're identifying, is it a legal decision? Is it an ethical decision? It could be a bit of both. Take care of the legal decision, comply, do what is required of you under the law. Once you've done that, then you move into the ethical decision-making process. So here, it's a little bit more complicated, less clear-cut. So here we are moving into consideration of the positions and perspectives of others, something that you heard Kylie talk about. What different perspectives might be at play? And we'll talk a little bit about this in a moment using another example. Then we form a response based on the Code of Ethics. So you have an Early Childhood Australia Code of Ethics, a document hopefully that you know well, that you can reference in your thinking as you move forward. Then it's really helpful if you discuss it. Discuss it with who? Discuss it with your colleagues, discuss it with the families, discuss it with the children, discuss it with your neighbours, discuss it with your family, discuss it with your educational leader. Then and only then make a decision. So decide something. Decide to do something, decide to do a little bit of something, a little bit less of the other thing, decide to do something on Wednesday that's different on Thursday. Then after that, you reflect and replan so that you say, what else will I do after that decision so that I know whether the decision was really good? Reflection and replanning, it's you heard that from Kylie. She was really able to say reflection, writing down some notes about these things helped her then to be a better decision maker in the future. This is good for the ethical component. It's also good for the legal component to make sure that you are indeed complying and you have records of the decisions that you're making, particularly if they are legal decisions. So this cycle is a really good one to get better at over time. And the more you do it, the more you get better at it and you get practice at it. I want to give you an example just as we sort of end up for today and we start to concluding is, you know, something like a celebration is always a really good thing to think about. So in this situation, a family might come to you and say, I want to celebrate Halloween. Now, you might say, I've never celebrated Halloween. It's not something that we do in our family daycare home. Halloween isn't really a thing. So I'm going to go and decide, am I going to do it or I'm not going to do it? The first thing I might do is going to identify whether it in fact is a legal decision or an ethical decision. So here you might go and check the policies and procedures. You might check the legal requirements in terms of your decision making. You might check the regulations. You might check the Guide to the National Quality Framework. You might go and talk to your coordination unit and say, is there a law around Halloween? They're probably going to say to you, no law about Halloween. There might be aspects of it that might, you know, collide with other risk processes that you might use. But generally speaking, Halloween would be considered an ethical decision, not a legal decision. But you have to decide that based on the conversations in your local context. Check those things first. Once you've done that, then you move into the ethical process and off we go around the cycle. We then consider the perspectives of other people. What would all the different families think? What do you think? What does your family think? What do we think about this? What's the different perspectives on this? Then we use the Code of Ethics, which gives us some really clear direction about listening and learning to families, supporting children's cultural identity, giving children opportunities to learn about the world around them. And then we discuss those with as many people as possible. We talk about, what do you think if we did this? If we did this, you can see why you have to go slow. What do we think if we did this? Check with other people. What have other colleagues have done? What do check with your educational leader? Check with another family daycare service. You might want to check out what the conversation is a little bit on social media, but be a little bit careful in that place because lots of chatter in that doesn't necessarily give you really sound information and information that's accurate about your context. So watch out for that. And then you decide to celebrate or not to celebrate. Or you might celebrate a little bit, not too much. You might want to talk to children about what this is because you notice there's a few things happening in the local community. And then once you've acted, you start to reflect and replan about what you might do next year and how you might change it. You might want to reflect on the feedback that you got from the families because they might have said it's fantastic, or they might have said, well, we didn't really like it. So based on that, then you make a further decision. But here we really want to emphasize how important it is to have a rigorous process that underpins your decision making. And of course, we're using some of the things that we talked about right at the beginning about identification, communication, etc., that are really good for decision making, but also to be able to do this in relationship with others. The more you practice this cycle, the more it will be in your head. And therefore, when you have a situation, you'll be able to immediately go, aha, is this a legal decision or an ethical decision? No, I think it's an ethical decision, or I'm going to check to see what it is. And then I'm going to work through this process to make an ethical decision around the thing that I'm considering, taking the perspectives of others, forming a response based on the code of ethics and what is right to do, what you ought to do, discussing that, deciding, and then reflecting and replanning. So that does bring us to the end of our webinar tonight, this PD in your pocket opportunity to think about yourself as a professional decision maker. One thing we do really know is that there's lots of opportunities for you to think about being a really strong professional decision maker, both a legal decision maker and an ethical decision maker. And I want to encourage all of you to practice that with your colleagues. It's a very important opportunity for you to consider your role as you keep moving forward. So we do have just a little moment left to just check out to see if there's any particular questions. And I'm just going to see whether Nikki is available for us to see whether there's any particular questions coming through. Feel free to ask each other some different things in the chat. Lots of thank yous for people tonight based on our conversation, but I'll just check in with Nikki to see whether there are any questions coming through. Anything particularly? I think big thank you to everybody for joining. I know it's very late at night for some of you, lots of things, and you're up early tomorrow morning. No, I can see that there's lots of thank yous and lots of accolations around being here tonight, which is very much appreciated. And I know that our colleagues in New South Wales Family Day Care really appreciate your feedback, and some of the things that you are sharing with us tonight are really important. If you haven't already, and I will share my screen one more time just to share that information, if you haven't already downloaded the material that you can get in relation to PD in your pocket, can you please take an opportunity to do that now? And of course, the recording will be available, and indeed the booklet will be available. So take a little moment to do that. And can I thank you all absolutely for your efforts in relation to decision making, particularly those that support, which pretty much is all of them, support the rights and best interests of children. Good luck as you continue to do that and continue to make decisions, because that's how you strengthen the process. And of course, reach out to your colleagues and do that in a supportive environment. That'll help you become a stronger professional decision maker. Thanks everybody for your participation tonight. And make sure you check out other PD in your pocket opportunities brought to you from the team at New South Wales Family Day Care. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for participating in this episode of PD in Your Pocket. This series was produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal peoples. If you'd like to watch or listen to other episodes in this series, or find out more information about this program, you can find us at our website at nswfdc.org.au/PD in your pocket.